Before we dive further into the Government of Canada's spending habits, we need to define a few terms. Chris, can you please explain to me what is a budget surplus?
So budget surplus is when we take in more money than we spend. So then we're left with some extra.
It's a good thing, right? I hope. Do
Yes.
we all agree it's a good thing?
Yes.
What's a budget deficit, Carolina?
When we spend more money than we get in.
There we go. So, Carolina, you have a fun fact envelope here. I want you to pull it out and read it to the viewers.
Drum
here.
roll,
Let's see.
please, if I can get this out. All right, fun fact. The last time we had a balanced budget was when we spent the same amount that we made was more than 20 years ago.
More than 20 years ago. Does that provide any concerns to anybody?
Yes, absolutely.
Do we need to go over sometimes in terms of what we bring in? Do we need to go over, get in a budget deficit to afford more things?
Absolutely.
Probably.
Let's simplify this for some people here.
Well, like if you go to, I don't know, a grocery store, if you go to like a furniture store and you don't have money, you need to be able to have a couch that you buy, and then you have a couch that you can rest on now, so you can
Right.
continue working, and then you bring in more money.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Sorry,
Chris.
we need to invest in the future, obviously. So there's going to be times where we're going to need to spend more than we're bringing in. That might be investing in education, or if we have an aging population, okay, maybe we need to get our healthcare system ready for that aging population, whatever the case may be. So there's going to be times, but then there is a point where you could argue it becomes irresponsible, where we continuously are budgeting poorly, overspending, and that kind of becomes a cycle, and then we're getting saddled with debt payments and all of that stuff.
Right. I want to take a look at what the government has spent money on in the past. Let's pull up the graph here, guys. It's actually really interesting. Everybody at home, take a good look at it. But to the panel, anything that stood out to you on the graph? I know you mentioned healthcare. You guys were wondering a little bit what other functions are.
Mine was education. That's surprising.
You think that's too low?
I think that's super low.
Do you think healthcare is too low?
Healthcare is low, but healthcare and education is primarily provincial jurisdiction. So the federal government is responsible for transfer payments out of their budget. So that's why it might seem low, but it could be bigger. But I was actually surprised not to see housing on the graph.
That was one concern. So just for everybody at home, other functions means housing. It's included in that. I mean, we are in such a housing shortage. To see it only be 11%, and it's not even 11%. It's housing is a little sliver inside that 11%. So things like that, I guess, how do we go about knowing what we need to spend money on and what we don't? Is there any rational decision making behind that?
I think the first step is awareness, right? Like everyone having this conversation at home, actually thinking about it. We just started it, and maybe we didn't really know where our money was going. Now we're having this conversation. I think you being aware of saying, okay, where are my tax dollars going? And then what politicians, what political parties kind of align with how I think money should be spent. That's probably the best way for the average person to influence it.
Yeah, and I think focusing on the root problem, not kind of the effects of that root problem. So, not funneling money into something that's, for example, healthcare. We don't have any doctors, we need more money. Well, we don't have any doctors to begin with, so why don't we fund education, make probably more med schools in Canada?
It's like a cause and effect.
Yeah.
So one of the biggest mistakes that the Canadian government and I think provincial governments make here is we just throw money at a problem just to say that we did something without addressing the root of the problem. So if healthcare is in shambles and I just say, here's $10 billion, and what am I supposed to do with this? Thanks for the money, but I have nothing to implement it with. We have no systems in place. Exactly. So we're in a staffing shortage in most of the provinces, if not all. Here's $10 billion, but who am I hiring with the $10 billion?
Absolutely.
That is one thing that a lot of people seem to have a problem with, is the government just seems to contract out services, but doesn't really do a lot of digging into what those companies that they contract out are doing.
I think it's because politicians are acting too politically. It's too much of about because it sounds good to say I gave $10 billion to healthcare, right? That'll get votes. $10 billion to healthcare. But if you're not actually addressing the problem, then your $10 billion is
you're not
useless. You're not
fixing
doing anything. But
anything.
it sounds good. It gets me elected again, and we keep the cycle going.
So one point that I want to bring up, and Anthony, feel free to jump in on this one, is a lot of people say, we should stop paying so much, or stop paying so much in taxes. The government should stop spending so much. Yeah. But what things do we lose if we stop spending?
You lose social services immediately. That's the first thing that comes under attack. Social services, primarily healthcare, which is probably the biggest expenditure in most of the provinces. Education is next. Here's a quick example. The first one, student grants is usually the first one that's on the chopping block. Putting people in university and college. And that's something that I think is extremely important, but that's my opinion. Those are the two biggest ones that'll be on the austerity chopping block.
So if we can't really cut our expenses, how do we pay back the $2.1 trillion in debt that we have?
You don't.
You just never
You never
will.
do.
You know what? I guess that's something that we have to come to terms with. I'm looking forward to diving a little bit more in depth into that. For everybody at home, we're doing a more educational episode. So take this with a grain of salt. We're trying to dive into each topic to educate you so you can understand a little bit more of where the government's spending their money and what you should be more aware of.
Rule the world, I'ma rule the world, yeah.